Chapter 60. By the time I got back to the office, I was on fire. I had more information, specifically that a woman hired the Dominicans to shoot me. I wanted this whole ordeal over as soon as possible. Some of my ad hoc task force was already there, and I called in Cassie Max and Roddy Huerta. When we all gathered in a conference room, Roddy was the first to say, "You do realize you're not my sergeant. You can't just order me into the office anytime you want to talk to me." Cassie casually turned toward Roddy and said, "Shut up and maybe learn something." I appreciated that kind of support. I hate to admit it, but I got a kick out of seeing Roddy brought down a peg or two. I said, "I think I have something that'll change how we look at this case." I glanced around the table. The detectives and the 3 forensics people were all staring at me intently. "I have a tip that a woman hired the Dominican gunman who tried to shoot me. They describe her as beautiful." Roddy shook his head. "You called us in to tell us that? An attractive woman is trying to murder you? Are you bragging?" "No, numbnuts. I'm telling you this because it's a lead. I know we've all looked through surveillance videos trying to identify a suspect, but I've been looking for a man. Not only is that sexist, it's also the biggest trap a detective can fall into. I got tunnel vision. Now I'm hoping you guys can help me out. If we all start reviewing surveillance videos, we might be able to get an image of this woman." Roddy said, "And what if she's just a go-between? Maybe the killer really is a man." "I'm not sure how you want me to respond to that, Roddy. Are you saying we should ignore this lead? I think we should run it down, and if we find her, see if we can't get her to identify who she's working for. It's kind of basic police work. Also, this fits in with the murder at the hospital. The corrections officer who were guarding the murdered gunman both said they spoke to a woman. They just couldn't give any description and didn't know exactly how she was involved. She may have just been a distraction." Cassie said, "I have hours of video from businesses around Madison Square Park. I didn't have any idea what to look for, but I'm willing to give it a shot." Roddy said, "That shitty hotel purposely doesn't want anyone knowing who comes and goes, and there are no businesses at the entrance that would have surveillance. I did grab a tape from an electronics store not far from the rear entrance to the hotel. I looked at it, but wrote off the females who were leaving as prostitutes." Cassie let out a laugh and said, "Typical." I intervened before Roddy got too bent out of shape. "Unless anyone else has anything useful to add, I would recommend we all get to work. There are other pieces of this puzzle that might fall into place." As the little meeting broke up, I looked over to my lieutenant. Harry Grissom hadn't said a word during the meeting as he leaned against the back wall with his arms folded. Now he looked at me like he was about to speak. Instead, he just nodded and grunted something that could have been, "Good job." Chapter 61. Alex took advantage of being alone in the Dominican's apartment. She didn't just sit on the couch and wait. She did a good, thorough search of the place, putting everything back where she found it. To Alex, planning was a part of the job she enjoyed. With attention to detail and preparation, she felt ready all the time. The kitchen drawers gave up something that really interested her. This creep had a photograph of her from the time when they had sat at the White Castle talking about things. It was clear that his friend had taken it somehow when she wasn't paying attention. They had printed out at least 2 copies. From a photographer's point of view, the picture wasn't that bad. He had been lucky to catch the light just right, and her hair was over her shoulder, away from her face. It was really quite flattering. From another point of view, the fact that these men were serious enough about killing her to hand out photographs made her angry. She didn't know how many were in the group, but it was definitely suffering some serious casualties, and it was only going to get worse. In the next drawer, there was an old-fashioned Smith & Wesson .38 revolver. It was the kind of weapon you used up close for protection. It was small, simple, and reliable. She took it out of the drawer and stuck it in her purse. She'd find a way to use it sometime. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, and from what she could tell, at least 2 men lived there. They weren't particularly tidy, and a nasty odor of stale beer and cigarette smoke hung in the air. She didn't care for it at all. She also found the photograph she had given them of Detective Michael Bennett, which she found on the internet, but it was clear and showed the handsome detective's face in full. Her recent research on the internet had turned up quite a bit of information about the detective. Since it was obvious she was the one who was going to finish the contract on him, she wanted to know everything she could. Alex respected a man who adopted 10 children. He'd been very smart and careful not to let any of the children's photographs appear on the internet. No news story carried any information about them. Several articles referenced the fact that he had adopted a number of children, but there was no mention of names or descriptions. It was a shame someone felt like a man like this had to die, whereas no one really cared about incompetent idiots like the men who lived in this apartment. She hated doing something like this for no money, but she couldn't risk their trying to kill her again. The answer was to send a strong and serious signal that no one should mess with her. Just as she placed Bennett's photo back in the folder on the cheap, shaky table, she heard the floor creak just outside the door. She froze in place. Then she heard the key slip into the lock. The door started to open. Chapter 62. As the door swung open, Alex was ready. She stood in the corner of the main room, perfectly still. The gun she'd taken from the drawer was in her right hand. She watched as a man stepped into the apartment, but it wasn't the person she was expecting. This man was too young and too tall. He had a little acne on his face and thick, curly hair. He shut the door and tossed a plastic bag of groceries onto the kitchen counter. He walked across the room and flopped onto the leatherette couch, then clicked on the TV. Alex knew she was stealthy, but this was ridiculous. All he had to do was turn his head a few degrees to the left and she'd be in plain view. Instead, his eyes were glued straight ahead as she heard the ESPN intro music on the TV. It was an odd feeling to be in a room with someone who had no idea you were there. It was almost like watching a movie. It was like some new, fantastic, interactive television. It sent an odd thrill through her, and she savored it for almost a full minute. The longer she waited, the greater the surprise. This man was clueless. It was embarrassing that he and his associates thought they could kill her. Alex just watched the man until he unbuttoned his pants and started to slip his hand down them. Then she stepped away from the wall and said in a calm tone, "Who are you? Where is Willie?" "Jesus Christ!" he shouted as he sprang to his feet and tried to close his pants. "Who the hell are you? What are you doing here?" Then recognition set in, and he said, "Oh, it's you. Willie isn't here." "Who are you?" "His cousin, Julio." The driver he mentioned. She thought about it for a moment and said, "When will Willie be home?" Just as he started to answer, she raised the revolver and pointed it at his face. It had the effect she wanted. Julio said, "He usually comes home in the afternoon, about now. When I talked to him on the phone earlier, he said he'd be here." "Good boy. You're using your head." "But you're not using yours. Willie is really a bad man. Everyone knows him. Everyone's afraid of him. If you shoot me, he'll know who did it." Alex said, "I hope so." Then she fired once, striking Julio in the dead center of his chest. He took a slight step backward, then tumbled onto the couch. He let out a raspy breath and tried to say something. He never got it out. His eyes didn't close, even after his heart stopped. Those lifeless brown eyes seemed fixed on Alex. She shook off the unnerving stare of the dead man and surveyed her work for a moment. She lifted his right leg onto the couch and crossed it over his left. She straightened his body against the pillow so that it looked like he was reclining on the couch. Then Alex stepped back and looked at the room again. A plan popped into her head. This could work out. Chapter 63. Alex Martinez could hear her second target trudging up the stairs and through the hallway for 20 seconds before he reached the door. She'd been sitting in the apartment with the dead man for almost a quarter of an hour. This came as a relief. She stood behind the door when it swung open and immediately saw the heavily tattooed left arm of Willie Perez. He was chatting on the phone in Spanish. Yeah, baby, I know. No, you can't come over here. My cousin wouldn't like it. Okay, I'll talk to him. Alex didn't have to be a mind reader to tell what the conversation was about. Willie called out to his cousin on the couch. From this angle, all he could see was the top of his cousin's head and the TV playing in the background. When he got no response, he called out louder, "Julio!" Behind him, Alex said, "He's not going to answer you." She couldn't hide her smile when Willie flinched and spun around to see the barrel of a gun right in his face. Willie said, "I guess you're not here to pay me." "Do you really think you earned anything?" Now Willie focused on the gun for a moment. He said, "Is that my revolver?" "It is." While keeping the snub-nosed revolver pointed at Willie's face, she used her left hand to pat down his waistband. She felt a gun hidden in his belt and pulled free a Taurus 9mm pistol. She placed the revolver on the kitchen counter and pointed the newly acquired semi-automatic pistol at Willie's head. She backed him up past the couch so he could get a good look at his cousin. Willie just stared at him. Alex said, "A single gunshot in this neighborhood doesn't draw any attention. I doubt your neighbors like you enough to call the cops if they heard a problem anyway. You won't get away with this." "Who's going to catch me? The police? They'll be glad you're gone." Willie shook his head and said, "I knew you were trouble the first time I saw you. Who looks like you and then decides to kill people for a living? You've got something very wrong with you, lady. The fact that you found it easier to kill me than the person I paid you to kill makes me question your judgment. And what were we supposed to do about you killing Cesar in the hospital? Which is why I have to do this today. I guarantee your friends on your crew will know exactly what happened." Willie nodded. "I could see your point. Perhaps we were out of line. Maybe we could work something out." Alex knew it would be easier if she were able to position him before she pulled the trigger. She needed him to move more to his right, so he was right in front of the couch, as though he and his cousin had had an argument face to face. That was her mistake. She didn't have her full focus on the killer in front of her. Instead, she was thinking ahead. As Willie shuffled away from her, he paused at the low coffee table between them. Willie said, "Let me say one thing." As Alex said, "What's that?" Willie kicked the coffee table hard into her shins, distracting her and making her lose her balance. He sprang across the space between them and wrapped a strong hand around her wrist so she couldn't point the gun anywhere but straight up. Most people would struggle against the power of his grip and try to get the hand free. Alex had too much training and experience for that. She lifted her knee and caught Willie on the thigh, making him step back. He was strong and tough and jerked her along with him. Then he twisted, and they both tumbled onto the couch. Alex found herself sandwiched between the dead man and the man trying to kill her. Chapter 64. They struggled on the couch as Willie used his size and strength to keep the pistol pointed away from him. Alex wished she could get to her stiletto, but she'd have to make do with just her fist for now. She punched him once directly in the Adam's apple. The shock and inability to breathe made him shrink back and ease his grip on her wrist. Her next blow was to his solar plexus, knocking out any wind he had left. That sent him off Alex, and he struggled to stand up. He took a few steps back and ended up in almost the exact spot Alex wanted. She was lying on top of his dead cousin. It didn't line up any better than this. She fired once, and the bullet hit him in almost the same place where she had punched him. He slapped both his hands over the wound in a futile effort to ease the pain and stem the bleeding. He stood staring at Alex, as if he couldn't believe she'd do something like that in his own home. Willie just stared at her, trying to form a word. He wheezed and coughed. Blood mixed with his spittle as it flew onto the coffee table. The ESPN music blared from the TV again. After what felt like hours, but was really only 10 seconds, he dropped to his knees, then fell forward. She got off the couch and checked his pulse. It was weak for a few beats, then faded out completely. Alex listened carefully for any movement in the hallway or any signs of concern from the neighbors. There was nothing, just as she expected. It was a little more difficult than she had anticipated, but the results were exactly what she wanted. She slipped on the plastic gloves she always kept in her purse. The one time a date had found them, she told him the oval case contained a diaphragm. Of all her professional equipment, gloves were the easiest thing to hide in a purse or suitcase. Now was the time for her meticulous nature to come out. She had to arrange the crime scene. She put the Taurus semi-automatic pistol in Julio's hand. She found the spent casing the gun had ejected when she shot Willie and rubbed it on Julio's hand and arm, then tossed it back onto the floor. She thought that would be enough to fool people if they bothered to test the dead men for gunshot residue. Then she picked up the revolver, removed the spent casing from the cylinder, and rubbed it on Willie's right hand. Then she returned the casing and nestled the revolver in his hand. She stepped back and admired her work. The time of death was close enough to make it hard for the medical examiner to determine that the shots came 15 minutes apart. The longer the two bodies stayed here undetected, the more difficult the task would be. She spent another minute making sure the apartment was in order and wiping down any surface she'd come in contact with. Alex slipped out of the apartment. That familiar exhilaration sweeping through her. She may not have been paid, but she handled something vital, and she had done it well. As she came down the stairs, Alex noticed the woman she'd helped with the groceries earlier standing in her doorway. Alex waited a moment until the woman turned back into her apartment, then she scampered down the last few stairs and darted out the back door without anyone seeing her. There were no police cars racing to the apartment, so no one had been alarmed by the two separate gunshots. She knew people in a building like this wouldn't cooperate much with the police. Even if they figured out it was a staged double murder, they had nothing they could pin on her. She walked along the sidewalk down 129th Street. Now, she could focus totally on Michael Bennett. Chapter 65. I was sitting at my desk in Manhattan North Homicide when I noticed a message on my computer alerting me to an active homicide investigation up on 129th Street in Harlem. Normally, I keep my eyes open for homicides in general just so I know what's going on in the city. I found enough to keep me busy on the homicides I was assigned to, so I didn't run off to every crime scene. But the address made me take a second look. It was Julio Laza's building. I had a bad feeling. I arrived on the scene about half an hour later. Before I could pull out my ID, I saw Roddy Huerta step out from the apartment and say, "It's okay, this old geezer is with me." I carefully stepped into the apartment, avoiding the crime scene techs and photographers. Roddy stood next to me and said, "Happened sometime yesterday. The neighbors said they were so used to loud noises and men coming and going all the time that they ignored it." I said, "They ignored gunshots coming from the building? These were two dope dealers. They were bullies, too. Everyone in this building is just relieved they don't have to worry about them anymore." Roddy pointed across the room and said, "The guy on the floor is Willie Perez." He brought up a booking photo of Perez on his cell phone. Then he brought up a photo of the other man. Roddy said, "The dead man on the couch is," I mumbled, "Julio Laza." "That's right. How do you know that?" I looked at the younger detective with his sharp suit and his reputation for following policy to the letter. I had done nothing by the book. I should never have cut a deal with someone who tried to shoot me. I wondered if this would be the last conversation I'd ever have as a detective with the NYPD. I could see Roddy was angry, so I let him out of the apartment away from the cops working the scene. At the far end of the hallway, I had to sit on the stairs as I filled him in on my conversation with Julio and the fact that he and his cousin had tried to shoot me. Roddy rolled his eyes. "Are you trying to tell me this is all part of your assassin conspiracy? The woman from Colombia who no one in New York ever seems to see coming? Give me a break, Bennett. I think you're starting to go senile." "Yeah, I wish it was as simple as that. But I have a couple of years of experience, Roddy. I do something the book never tells us to. I follow my gut instincts sometimes. Maybe you should try it. Maybe, but I get good results, and I've never been disciplined. Can you say that? Is a letter in your personnel file that important? I know I'm doing what's right. Cutting a deal with killers, that's not right. Our job is to arrest assholes like that. Our job is to protect and serve. All you seem to be protecting is your reputation. After a few moments, Roddy said, I'd say for a hot-shot homicide, Dick, you really screwed this one up. Finally, I said, Look, Roddy, I've got a lot of reasons to stop this Colombian woman, not just because of Antrol or that she's trying to kill me. Someone went after my son in prison. She might be able to lead me to the person who ordered it. Does Lieutenant Grissom know about all this? I didn't answer. I didn't want Harry in trouble, too. Now Roddy was showing his outrage. Do you guys understand anything about best practices? I know you laugh at me because I follow procedures on everything, but those procedures were created for a reason. We don't stop and frisk anymore because some officers took it too far. We have our cars inspected so often because some detectives never kept up with maintenance. And we don't get involved in cases with a personal connection because it could affect our judgment and it's a conflict of interest. I was about to rebut his argument, or at least ignore him, when I realized he was right. That hurt. I mumbled, Any fool can make a rule and every fool will mind it. Roddy said, What's that? Henry David Thoreau. It was a quotation I used to live by thanks to my philosophy degree. Roddy said, Henry who? That Syracuse education of yours didn't include philosophy? Roddy's surly look told me all I needed to know. I sighed, stood up and said, You're going to tell IA about my trek-off policies and procedure? Roddy glanced down the hallway to make sure no one was close enough to hear anything. The longer he took to answer, the tighter the knot in my stomach became. Finally he said, Not just yet. Maybe we can both learn something on this case. Chapter 66. I sat on my couch staring out the wide windows at the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I had a hard time believing that a squabble between Julio and his cousin resulted in both of their deaths. Willie Perez was a terrible person. All the records I could find on him indicated that he was involved in several murders, even though he'd never been charged. Julio Laza wasn't much better. His records were for narcotics trafficking, but I had no illusions about what he'd do if he had to. It didn't matter now because they were both gone. I hated to be selfish, but that mainly meant they couldn't help me with my case anymore. I was at a loss. Then Trent strolled into the room and plopped down on the couch next to me. If there was such thing as a ray of sunshine, it was Trent. He was the youngest of my boys, with bright brown eyes and the darkest complexion of any of the kids. When we adopted him, there was very little information about his family or circumstances. He was only 3 weeks old at the time. From the first days, Maeve and I just fell in love with him. He had a real sense of humor, too. More than once I found him lining up his brothers, then standing between them and singing the Sesame Street song, One of These Things is Not Like the Others. Trent said, What you doing, Dad? Nothing, bud. Just enjoying the view. Is something wrong? I smiled at the boy and rubbed his head. No, just thinking about work. You always tell us that family is more important than work. I said, It is. Well, we're doing great as a family. He smiled and held up an algebra test. It looked like a foreign language to me, but I understood the teacher's comments at the top. Sister Agnes wrote, Very impressive, Mr. Bennett. We need to find something more challenging for you. The nuns could be formal, but they never gave false praise. That's great, Trent. You never fail to amaze me. I love that you have your own way of doing things. It's very logical. You'd be a good philosopher. But I like math. You could be a philosopher like Pythagoras. He was also a mathematician. You mean the Pythagorean theorem? Yes, exactly. I have no idea what the theorem is, but I've heard of it a couple of times. Trent said, It has to do with the triangle. The square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides. I just stared at him. Eddie was so brilliant that sometimes I forgot how smart some of the other kids were as well. Now there's good news and bad news, my boy. What's the good news? I'm going to buy you that new baseball glove you've been looking at and take us out for a nice dinner. All of us. Super tacos? I guess if that's where you want to go. We live in New York City. There are 1,000 great restaurants. That you want to go to a taco place? Is that okay, Dad? I laughed. Of course. It's your night. Trent gave me a sly smile and said, Okay, what's the bad news? I'm going to have a talk with Sister Agnes, and your work is going to get a lot more difficult. Trent gave me that beaming smile and said, Bring it. Chapter 67. Announcing new plans for dinner caused quite a stir in the household. Mary Catherine seemed relieved that we were all going out. I pulled her aside to tell her about my conversation with Trent. Mary Catherine said, That's little shit. I beg your pardon? He acts like all he cares about is baseball and sports, but he's been hiding this from us for so long. He lets us focus on Eddie being some kind of genius while he's smart enough to coast along. Why do I think we're looking at this from two entirely different points of view? Oh, don't be silly, Michael. I'm thrilled. I just like to think I'm the slyest one in the family. I'll have to keep an eye on that one. No one could ask anything more than to have a fiancé with a great sense of humor. It was just one of the many things I was grateful for, and she took my mind off my problems for a few minutes. We were going to make the trek to Super Tacos on foot. It was only a few blocks away on West 96th Street. I was going to throw in a surprise visit for dessert at 16 Handles. Everyone loved the frozen yogurt there. Just as I had the younger kids lassoed and ready to get on the road, I noticed Juliana sulking on the balcony. The wind whipped her beautiful long hair behind her. She looked like a model, which I was sure hadn't escaped her. Mary Catherine stepped out onto the balcony, and I just watched the two of them interact for a minute. Mary Catherine put her arm around Juliana's shoulders and gave her a squeeze. As they stepped into the living room, I innocently asked, Everything all right? That made Juliana cry and rush into her bedroom. Mary Catherine waved me off and said, For a change, it's not your fault. What is it? Her boyfriend, Carter, broke up with her. I didn't realize they were actually boyfriend and girlfriend. Apparently, neither did he. Juliana found out he was dating other girls, two of them right from the set of their show. I better go talk to her. Do you think that's a good idea? I'm her father. I never have any good ideas, but I'm going to do it anyway. I lightly tapped on the door to Juliana and Jane's bedroom. I heard a muffled sound and eased into the room. Juliana was lying face down on her twin bed. I think I heard her say, Please leave me alone. As a father, I took that to mean, Sit on the side of the bed and talk to me for a few minutes, Dad. After I sat silently at the foot of her bed, she rolled over and looked at me. She said, I guess you were right about Carter. No, sweetheart, I wasn't. I was worried about him being too mature for you, but he proved he was not mature enough. I just hope you see that you deserve much better than a guy like that. She sat up on the bed next to me and leaned her head against my shoulder. Juliana said, It just hurts so bad. I thought we had something real. You did. He was just too stupid to realize it. I put my arm around her and wiped a tear off her cheek with my finger. There's nothing I could say right now that's not a stereotype of something every dad would say. But you are so beautiful and so smart that you'll have your choice of men across the city. And you've always got this guy who loves you no matter what. She squeezed me, then mumbled, Thanks, Dad. I patted her on the back and said, Do you feel like going to Super Tacos with us? It's up to you. No one will force you." She sniffled and said, "I heard Trent might be some kind of brainiac like Eddie. I can't miss a celebration for that. Can you give me a few minutes?" "As long as you need, sweetheart." I kissed her on the top of her head, and somehow I was the one who felt better. Chapter 68. My ad hoc task force on homicides had attracted some attention. While I was briefing the forensics people and some of the detectives involved, I noticed Internal Affairs Inspector Alice Whitcroft slip into a seat at the rear of the conference room. Roddy Huerta had been true to his word and not mentioned to anyone that I had cut a deal with Julio Laza just before he was murdered. He sat in his usual suit and tie, making notes as I spoke. I had to give him credit because he didn't even shoot me any sidelong glances when I talked about the murders and failed to mention Julio and his cousin, Willie Perez. Of course, there was no evidence that the two Dominican gunmen were murdered by our suspect, but I still believed it deep down. When I asked if anyone had anything new, Cassie Max was the first to speak up. She said, "I've done nothing but look through surveillance videos in the area of my two homicides. I have a couple of shots that don't show a face, but do show a woman with long brown hair, about 5'7", who seems to have something strapped across her that's not a purse." Cassie handed out photos taken from the video. She had described it perfectly. Roddy said, "I have a similar-looking woman coming out of the East Harlem Hotel. Can you see her face? No, just long hair, nice legs, and high heels. I discounted her the first time I saw her. Once you gave us more information, I zeroed in on her immediately." A plump forensics tech named Harry said, "I think she has a camera on a strap around her." I said, "How do you know?" "Because I have one strapped around me most of the day. No one ever even notices." Now, with a new perspective, I saw it too. It does look like a camera. Cassie Mack said, "Do you think she takes trophy photos?" I said, "Or is it a cover?" The meeting broke up on its own. Everyone had things they wanted to get done immediately. I thought I might slip out of the conference room without having to talk to Alice Whitcroft. I had nothing against her personally. It was just a general feeling that it was best to avoid internal affairs. The tall and fit 50-year-old woman nearly blocked the door to keep me from escaping. She smiled as she said, "Come on, Bennett, you really think you could evade me that easily?" I thought I'd try. I matched her gaze. I'm sure many a cop had melted under those intelligent blue eyes. "What are you doing here, Alice?" "Internal Affairs just wants to make sure one of the department's most well-known detectives is not too close to a case. I'm just helping out with a series of homicides. Technically, I'm not even the lead on any one homicide investigation. Well, as I understand it, you think these murders of Canadians could be related to the death of your partner, Antrell Martins. Am I right?" There was no sense in denying anything, but there was no reason to admit it either. "Possibly. We really don't have much yet." "Look, Mike, I get it. The public is never that outraged by the murder of a cop. They remember every shitbag shot by a cop in the middle of the night, but aside from a few headlines and a high-profile funeral, no one remembers the names of cops killed in the line of duty except other cops. No matter what you think, Internal Affairs is still staffed by cops. I don't want to stand in your way. I just don't want you to get in the trick bag either. Since when is Internal Affairs so worried about my job security? Since the Post called you the best detective the city ever produced. So it's more of a PR issue than a desire to catch a cop killer." The slick IA detective said, "Why can't it be both?" Chapter 69. Alex Martinez finished her conversation with both her daughters over a static-plagued cell phone line. Her daily conversations with Gabriella and Clemency just made her miss home that much more. It didn't help that her mother called every other day and made her feel guilty about staying so long in New York. She sat at a computer in a cafe a few blocks from Times Square. She'd been making notes from articles and posts about Detective Michael Bennett on the internet. Normally, this was the part of her job she really enjoyed, but now she was ready for some time with her daughters and her horses. As she was reading yet another article about Bennett's involvement in the famous case of hostages taken at the First Lady's funeral, her phone buzzed. Only a few people had the number. For a moment she was scared something could be wrong at home, even though she'd just spoken to the girls. When she looked down, she recognized the number as that of her mounted police officer, Tom McLaughlin. She let the phone go to voicemail. As sweet and fun as Tom was, she had a job to do, and she wanted to do it as quickly as possible. She still could find no photographs of or information about any of Bennett's children. Not that she would ever hurt a child, but the kids could be a trail to the detective's weakness. Or perhaps she could use one as bait. At this point she didn't care, as long as she was able to finally close the contract on Bennett. She decided to start serious surveillance, which meant she had to rent a car. The first place she watched was his office on Broadway and 133rd Street. Unless you knew what you were looking for, there was no way to tell that this was an official police office. There were a lot of Chevrolet Impalas and Ford Crown Victorias parked on the street around the building and under the elevated train track, but the building itself was unmarked and innocuous. Alex was peering out of her open driver's side window when a rap on the trunk of her car startled her. When she looked into the rearview mirror, she saw a tall black woman, a traffic enforcement agent, strolling to her window. Alex smiled and said, "I'm sorry, do you need me to move the car?" The woman didn't say anything but leveled a stern glare at Alex. She said, "It's too late. The signs posted all around here clearly say no parking or stopping." She pulled out her ticket book and started writing. Alex said, "I'm still in the car. I never got out. I was just stopping for a few moments to check my phone." "I saw you sitting here for more than 6 minutes. That's 6 minutes of breaking the law. That's an awfully long time to be checking your phone. I don't care how pretty you are." She stepped to the rear of the vehicle and noticed from the tag that it was a rental. "Where are you from, young woman?" Without hesitation, Alex said, "Philly." "Well, I don't know if Philadelphia enforces the law, but here in New York, we do." She wrote something else in her ticket book, then continued to lecture Alex. "If you don't pay attention to the signs, you get a ticket, just as simple as that." Alex didn't like the position she had been put in and couldn't afford to be readily identified by someone who worked for the city. Her pistol was stuffed next to the seat for tactical purposes. She always carried it there when she was driving. She was prepared for situations like this. The traffic enforcement agent said, "I need your license." Alex sighed and retrieved her wallet from her purse. She pulled out a valid Pennsylvania license in the name of Michelle Pagan and gave it to the agent. It was legit, except for the photo. It also would cost her $2,600 and was now useless. She'd have to toss it as soon as she was free of this overzealous agent. It was too bad. She had started to build this identity up nicely. As the woman finished writing the ticket, Alex noticed Detective Michael Bennett walk out of the main door of his building with another man. The man was almost as tall as Bennett and had an 80s mustache. He had to be another cop. Alex needed to get going and felt her anxiety rise. She was careful not to snatch the ticket from the parking attendant when she signed it. There was no sense in pushing this woman any further. She scribbled her false name, then darted into traffic with the rental car. She could see Bennett's Impala a few blocks up and fell into her surveillance mode again. Chapter 70. I wasn't that crazy about meeting the regulator again. I understood he had a certain image and wanted to project that he was quirky and odd and that everyone could trust him, but he was nevertheless involved in the drug trade. I didn't care if he talked about curbing violence and making everyone happy. He still lived off other people's misery. Sergeant Tim Marcia had once again set up a meeting. We had to find out more information because the last lead the regulator had given us was a dead end. With Julio Laza out of the picture, I had nowhere else to look. We met in the lobby of the Aloft Hotel a little south of our office. The bar tucked in next to the side entrance was empty, and we sat at a table where no one could hear us. The skinny young waiter delivered my Coca-Cola and a glass of scotch for John, the regulator. Today, John was a little more dressed up, with a long-sleeved plaid shirt and a bolo tie. His long silver-streaked hair was tied back in a tight ponytail, and the beautiful woman who had been sent to keep an eye on him was nowhere in sight. I didn't ask any questions about it. He insisted on paying for his drink, and I noticed the first name Johann on his American Express card. Again, I wasn't going to ask any questions. The regulator said, "I heard what happened to the Dominicans I told you about. Did you have anything to do with their deaths?" "Not at all." "You realize that no one on the street or in their crew believes they shot each other in an argument?" "I don't believe it either." "The whole crew is running scared. Whoever they cross has no sense of humor whatsoever." I said, "I was hoping you might have another lead for me or some information I could use." The regulator shook his head and said, "I was lucky to get those names. Things are odd right now with this unpleasantness going on between the Mexicans and the Canadians. So you have no idea why they would want to kill me." The regulator said, "The question is, what would lead them to you? What connection do you have to the Mexican cartel?" I thought about everything that had happened in the recent past. Brian being arrested, my being forced to shoot a teenage hitman named Diego in the Columbia Library, the man who had corrupted Brian. I snapped my fingers. The regulator said, "There's always a moment when things become crystal clear. What have you recalled, my friend?" "Caracatada." This time it was Sergeant Marcia who said, "The guy we arrested in his underwear? What's Caracatada mean again?" The regulator said, "Scarface." I said, "He's a dealer for the cartel. I locked him up a few months back and he's in Rikers Island right now." The regulator took a sip of the scotch and said, "Perhaps he could help." Chapter 71. Alex Martinez saw Bennett pull to the curb near the Aloft Hotel. She slipped her car into an overpriced lot and followed him and the other tall police officer into the lobby. Alex had been there before. She headed right for the lobby bar, where she almost ran into Bennett and the other detective, seated at a table tucked in behind the bar. There was something familiar about the man they were meeting. Alex picked up her camera and snapped a few photos inside the lobby, as if she were cataloging the architecture. A little girl in a pretty blue dress smiled and waved a tiny hand at her. Alex smiled back and knelt down so the little girl could see her camera more clearly. The girl's mother said, "Don't bother the nice lady, Susanna." Alex said, "No, it's fine. I miss my own daughters, so it's nice to see a friendly little girl." It was true that she missed her daughters, but the little girl also provided her with better cover. No one would suspect her if she was kneeling down to chat with a little girl in the lobby. Alex also used the opportunity to snap a quick photo of Bennett and the man he was meeting in the bar, an older man with long graying hair. Then Alex realized who it was. Johann Batterberg. He called himself John and claimed to be some kind of drug world negotiator. She had once heard him referred to as the narcotics whisperer. He brokered deals between rival gangs, avoiding unnecessary violence. Suddenly, she realized that Bennett was working hard at trying to figure out who had ordered the hit on him. He must have reasoned that it was someone in the narcotics business. He was definitely a smart detective. It was interesting that he was talking to the regulator. While the Austrian-born man was involved in a lot of different negotiations, the major cartels tended to ignore him completely. They gave no credence to the idea that anyone besides them wielded power in the business. She wondered what kind of information Johann could provide to Bennett. Suddenly, this was getting very interesting. She might have to move her schedule for eliminating Bennett ahead before he figured anything out. When the little meeting broke up, she already had her car ready to go. She watched Bennett and the other police officer as they stepped onto the street. Chapter 72. I didn't bring Sergeant Tim Marcia to Rikers Island with me. I was a little embarrassed that I had missed such an obvious link as Caricatada. His real name was Albert Stas, and he had been born in Uruguay, then raised in Mexico. I had barely even met the man, even though I was part of the team that arrested him and sat in on his early hearings. That didn't mean I didn't know a lot about him. He'd ruined my life. At least ruined it as much as any one man could. He had set up a network of high school students to sell various forms of methamphetamine and ecstasy. The Mexican cartel considered synthetic drugs the next logical step in their business plan. Unfortunately, my son Brian was one of the kids Stas had corrupted. Well, that's how it started, anyway. Later, he had used terror tactics to keep the kids in line. My son was so scared that he ended up going to prison without revealing any information. Now this creep was a link to the person who was after me. Talking to him would also give me an idea of who ordered the attack on my son in prison. I met a friend of mine, Corrections Lieutenant Vinny Mintis, who came with me to a special interview room where Stas was waiting. I had to calm myself down before entering, because the idea of seeing Stas in person made me think about committing a crime of my own. When I was ready, I went in and sat down on a hard metal chair at a flat, scarred wooden table and looked across at Albert Stas. He was in his 40s, and he really did have a fairly significant scar on his face. Other than that, there was nothing remarkable about the man. He looked back at me with flat brown eyes. I said, "Do you know who I am?" "I know." "You know why I'm here to talk to you?" "It doesn't matter, because I'm not telling you shit." I shrugged and looked over my shoulder at my friend who worked at Rikers every day. Lieutenant Mintis said, "You could help yourself out if you talk to us." "I got a lawyer for this case. I got nothing to say to you." Lieutenant Mintis smiled and said, "I'm talking about the potential assault case for the guy you attacked in the cafeteria last week." "You mean the black gangbanger? All I did was shove him." "Shove, tried to choke, who could say?" The lieutenant gave him a grin that even made me nervous. "You know how things work around here. You could be isolated and secured until trial. That ain't right, and you know it." I said, "Is it right to lure kids into selling drugs?" "Allegedly lure kids into selling drugs." It was my friend, the lieutenant, who said, "Cut the shit. If you want to avoid some additional charges, just listen to the questions Detective Bennett has for you. You may not even think they're important." Stas thought about it for a few seconds, then looked at me without much interest and said, "Go ahead." I said, "Who put out the contract on me and why? All I have is hearsay. It can never be used in court. No one will know we ever spoke to you." He waited a bit longer, then finally said, "The mama of that kid you shot in the library, Diego something. She's the one who pressured the cartel. I heard they even hired some hotshot killer from Bogota. Killer is supposed to take care of some Canadians, and I guess you too. From what I hear, the killer is really good. You might not live long enough to talk about our conversation." That made him grin, revealing yellowed, uneven teeth. I had a few more questions, but he didn't know anything that could help me. At least I felt a level of satisfaction for having tied a lot of this case together. Now we had to figure a way to find the woman from Colombia who was committing these murders. That was always the toughest job, stopping the killer. Chapter 73. The visit with Albert Stas had shaken me. Over the previous months, I had experienced a number of revenge fantasies about him. That was not the way I was raised or what my upbringing in the Catholic Church had taught me. It wasn't how I operated as a police officer. But I still fantasized about killing the creep, and that scared me. I had to clear my head. Some people might call it centering myself. That meant I needed contact with my family. Some men rushed to alcohol, some men to drugs, but in times of trouble, I needed my family. I didn't hesitate to head south toward Brooklyn. I hadn't been to the set where Juliana was filming her TV show in several days. Just seeing her would make me feel better. As I parked near the nondescript warehouse in Brooklyn Heights near the East River, the first person I saw was Juliana. She was standing outside the main door using her phone. As I walked up, she covered the mouthpiece of the phone and said, "I get lousy service inside, and by coming out here I get a little air and a few minutes away from Carter." I waited a few seconds while she finished her call. She was trying to register for some acting class in Greenwich Village. Then Juliana slipped her phone into her purse and gave me a hug. She said, "What brings you down here?" I shrugged. I just needed to see one of my kids, and I was curious about what was going on here at the set. You were curious how I was handling Carter since he dumped me. I'm more curious to know if you want me to do something to him. I gave her a smile to let her know I was kidding. Juliana said, "Ugh, Carter, I don't even want to think about that jerk." I was glad to see that anger had replaced sadness, the natural progression in breakups. Just then, the front door opened and Carter popped his head out. He said, "Come on, Jules, don't be like that." Then he saw me and went silent. I looked at him and said, "Like what?" He didn't say a word as he slipped back inside. Juliana laughed, and it lifted my whole world. I turned to her and said, "What are you filming today?" "Just some scenes with the star of the show." I like the way she put air quotes around star. The woman was an older actress whose name I didn't know. Juliana said, "Sometime this week I'm supposed to do 3 different interviews." "Well, that's exciting. Maybe I can come and distract you during one of them. It'll make you tougher." She laughed and said, "Dad, thanks for worrying about me." "Honestly, I don't know why I do. You seem to have everything under control." She hugged me. I said to her, "I came here for me, not so much for you. You don't have to thank me." Juliana said, "Then I'll just tell you that I think you're a great dad." Chapter 74. Alex Martinez had a difficult time keeping up with Bennett's car after he left Rikers Island. Surveillance was difficult, especially with only one person working it, but this was a part of the job she really enjoyed. Now she was definitely on her own. She didn't want to involve anyone else or use any other accomplices. The Dominican gang had illustrated the problems of using local help. She had done it a few times over the years, but never again. Alex considered a simple drive-by shooting while conducting the surveillance. Everything would have to fall in place just right, and she'd have to worry about witnesses and security video if she did it that way. It was better to work out a plan and stick to it. That's what she was good at. Her research on the internet had told her a few things about Bennett the man, including his adoption of 10 children. She still didn't have a photo of any of them. She stayed back about 6 cars as Bennett crossed over the East River by way of the Brooklyn Bridge. A few blocks later, in Brooklyn Heights, she saw the Impala pull into a lot across from a warehouse. For a moment, she wondered if everything had lined up just right. When he came through the parking lot, she could work it out so her car would not be far from him. But she remembered how quickly he reacted with the Dominican gunman. They'd tried basically the same thing, and it didn't work out for them. Still, just in case, Alex drew her semi-automatic pistol from her purse and slid it into its normal spot next to the driver's seat. She kept her right hand wrapped around the grip. She rolled down her window so she'd be ready if she got the chance. Bennett walked across the street in front of her quickly and was greeted by someone at the front of the building. As she drove down the street slowly, Alex saw Bennett speaking with a young woman standing outside the front door. She was tall and pretty with long dark hair. She gave him a quick hug as soon as she was done on her phone. Alex recalled that one of Bennett's adopted children was named Juliana and was about 18 years old. It was a pretty good bet that this young woman was Juliana. It looked like the oldest Bennett child had found a job on some kind of TV show. Now that Alex had a lead on one of the kids, she could explore it. It was sweet to see the father and daughter interact. Bennett was basically a good guy, but her profession didn't give her the option to ignore contracts just because the targets seemed like good people. Sometimes she had to just do her job. Chapter 75. Alex found a fancy coffee shop with Wi-Fi near Columbus Circle. She could have spent more time following Bennett around, but now she knew exactly what she was looking for. She had to discourage the young man working the counter who wandered over to her in an effort to flirt. As soon as he said, "So where are you from?" Alex scared him off with a perfect Colombian glare. Alex had walked around to check out the warehouse where she had seen Bennett greet the young woman. A card on one of the doors said that it was a set for a TV show called Century's End. A quick search on the IMDb database told her that the show was in production and scheduled to be released next year. The description said, "A drama set in the late 1990s revolving around young people making life decisions as a new millennium approaches." Didn't sound promising from the description, but it might work if the writing and acting were good. It listed the director and a producer and 6 of the series stars. One of the photographs was the girl she had seen, listed as Jules Baez, playing the role of Noreen Harwood. She looked up information for Jules Baez on several databases and found very little. It was interesting to note that she had received her Screen Actors Guild card very recently. Then she found an early description of Century's End on a different website, a gossipy industry insider newsletter. Alex pulled up the newsletter and found a short blurb about the TV show, listing the actress hired to play Noreen Harwood as Juliana Bennett. Excellent. To Alex, finding something like this was nearly as important as the hit itself. Anyone could point a gun, but only a true professional delved deeper and figured out how to complete the hit and lived to enjoy the rewards after it was all done. On the IMDb database, Jules Baez was listed as not represented in the section showing agent and management. That was one weakness all actors had. They lusted for good representation. Then she had a great idea. Tomorrow could be the turning point on this contract from hell. Chapter 76. I didn't know if it was the mounting stress of having someone trying to kill me, worrying about Brian in the hospital, or all the other little things a father has to keep track of, but I didn't feel refreshed when I woke up. I'd tossed and turned all night, and now I really felt it. I'd also hit some dead ends in my investigation. We still didn't have a clear photograph of the killer or anything that might identify her. Roddy Huerta had proved to be a better detective than I had originally thought. He also hadn't ratted me out to anyone about my using Julio Laza as a snitch before he was killed. That told me something about the man. Cassie Max was her usual blur of activity, and I noticed that she sent me an email every night around 11 o'clock updating me on everything she had done. I was never that organized, even when I was her age. I had a little time this morning and wanted to show my family some support. First, I was going to go by holy name and talk to Sister Agnes about Trent. I thought I might work in a visit to my grandfather as well. If I had time, I wanted to shoot down to Brooklyn and visit Juliana again. I knew she was still smarting from the breakup. As I walked to my police car in the garage across the street from our apartment, I was paying a lot more attention to cars passing me on the street and other pedestrians. I don't want to say that I was starting to get paranoid, but I definitely had my reasons. I was trying to change up my regular routine in case anyone was watching. I gave Mitch, the homeless man who always sat near the entrance to the garage, $2 before I went in instead of handing it to him from the window of my car as I did on most days. I engaged the 65-year-old Vietnam veteran in some conversation. "Hey, Mitch, have you seen anyone unusual hanging out around here?" His voice was deep and raspy. "You gotta give me more than that. This is New York. Everyone is unusual." "Any women you don't usually see?" "It's funny you ask. I see everyone, but only a few people see me. I appreciate that you even bothered to ask me. You always talk to me," I said, What about it? Have you seen anyone? Seen anyone do what? I patted him on the shoulder and said, Keep up the good work. It was time to head over to Holy Name and make sure Trent never had an easy math assignment again. That thought made me chuckle like a villain in a Disney movie. Chapter 77. I entered the Holy Name School through the main door and quickly found Sister Agnes in her office. She was busy grading tests at a comfortable-looking desk while balancing herself on a blue yoga ball. The NYPD had tried various chairs and desks in an effort to stop some of the back problems and health issues related to sedentary jobs, but I didn't care for stand-up desks. Then again, my job involved a lot of activity, maybe too much. Sister Agnes was dressed casually by nun standards, in a simple black shirt and skirt. She was a young-looking 40 and taught advanced math classes. She also coached the girls' basketball team. She was tougher than any cop I had ever met. Her brown eyes could make you wilt if you were in the wrong. She turned that look on me a couple of times over the years, the first time after I suggested a little less homework and a little more recess. More recently, there was a string of 3 days in a row with a late arrival by our entire family. I thought accepting full responsibility would save me. Instead, she set those eyes on me and said, Now I can tell how much influence Father Seamus has had on your life. We'll see if we can fix that. Once a student at Holy Name, always a student. Now she glanced up from her test when I stood in the doorway and simply said, Mr. Bennett, I thought my little note on trench algebra test might bring you in quickly for a chat. Well, you could have just asked me to come in for a parent conference. Based on the way you sometimes sneak the kids in when they're tardy, and based on the behavior of your grandfather, I thought it was best to use a little subterfuge. Call it a fun game on my part. I liked her. She motioned me to the seat, then twisted on her ball so she was sitting up straight. I could see the muscles in her forearm and wondered how much she could bench press. She said, I was hoping to talk to you about moving Trent forward quite quickly in some of the math classes. I also was wondering if perhaps we could pair him with Eddie in a special computer class we're going to put together with Columbia University. I just stared at her as if I didn't understand. Truthfully, the information and requests were a little overwhelming. She wanted my boys to take a class with Columbia students? They were just little boys in my eyes. Somehow I managed to mumble, yes, of course, whatever you think is best. After a moment, it all sank in, and I said, I don't think I realized Trent was so good with computers. Eddie is clearly a whiz with anything related to Windows-based and Linux-based computers. We feel our computer lab is no longer sufficient to support his interests, but it's Trent's mathematical ability that we think this computer class could really enhance. Often we find that an ability to work with computers is tied directly to mathematical comprehension. That all sounds great. What can I do to help? There may be some financial issues and cost, but nothing too extreme. If you need any kind of financial assistance, we feel this is important enough for the church to provide it. Thank you. I think I'll be able to come up with whatever we need. Is there anything else I could do to help? She hesitated. That was unusual for Sister Agnes. Finally, she said, Perhaps it would be best if your grandfather didn't know exactly what was going on. Sometimes he tends to get over-involved in your children's studies. I don't think he would ever admit that he may not be up to date on the latest technology. And I know he'd be afraid we're pushing the boys too quickly. Sometimes I think he would have each of your children held back just so he could see them every day here at school. I smiled because it was true. I also smiled because apparently Trent wasn't the only one hiding his abilities. Sister Agnes was much more astute and understood the subtleties of family relationships better than I had ever imagined. I said, I'll talk to Seamus. Chapter 78. I cut through the tidy courtyard from the school to the church administration building. I was beaming, at least on the inside. What parent doesn't want to hear that not one but two of his children are gifted? And gifted in an area that's so difficult. Clearly, I hadn't helped the boys with their computer or math skills as they grew up. I could go on about philosophers and their contributions to society, from the Greeks to the formation of the United States, but technology and math were not my strong suits. Holy name had been such a big part of my life that sometimes I took the church and school for granted. Not only were my children going to school here, where we attended services every Sunday, but the church was also essentially harboring my grandfather and giving him a strong purpose late in life. The idea of Seamus living with us as a retired bar owner with no purpose in life was the stuff of nightmares. God knows what would have piqued his interest. He was a great organizer, a talent the church utilized. He could have just as easily organized a gambling ring or some other semi-illegal endeavor, which would have caused me grief at every turn. Sister Agnes had just shown me how much she and the school cared about my children and their education. To say they were going above and beyond the call of duty was an understatement. The only thing they were asking in return was that I keep Seamus on his side of the church and out of Eddie and Trent's educational plans. Now I was walking into his clean, organized office and felt confident I'd find him in good health and with a worthwhile activity occupying him. I had two ways I could handle this. I could lie to him or just tell him to mind his own business. I found Seamus leaning back in a chair sipping coffee. He looked up at me from the desk. "What are you doing here, Michael?" "Just had an interesting conversation with Sister Agnes." "What could that Ivy League snob want to talk to you about?" "Why do you call her that?" My grandfather was not usually malicious. "She's got a degree of some kind of mathematics from Harvard, and she thinks I have absolutely no role in the school whatsoever." "You don't. You work at the church. Why would you have a role in the school?" "I have 10 great-grandchildren at the school. That's reason enough right there." This was not going to be as easy as I thought. Am I missing something? Do you have a personal issue with Sister Agnes? "I gave up personal issues when I entered the priesthood. I have never once faltered on the vows I made to the church." I caught the somber tone and edge of outrage. I said, "Not that kind of personal issue. I mean some issue you have with her at the school." He looked down at his desk for a moment, then said, "Okay, she might have nixed my suggestion that I teach a class on Irish history. Well, I can't imagine why a reasonable school administrator would turn down a chance to have a class taught by someone with no background in history or teaching." "Don't be a smart aleck. It doesn't become you. I learned oral history growing up in the old country, but she wasn't interested in any of that. She said there weren't many kids with an Irish heritage at the school. She said even my own great-grandchildren weren't technically Irish, at least most of them." I had dealt with Sister Agnes for years, and I knew she wouldn't have used the tone that Seamus was using now. But I saw her point. The kids here came from varied and interesting backgrounds. They probably wouldn't fully appreciate fables told by an elderly priest who still had an Irish accent. I waited for him to calm down a little, then said, "I'm sorry she shot down your idea. But you have to recognize there's great opportunities coming for Eddie and Trent, and I don't want you to cause any heartburn about it. Understood?" He bowed his head and mumbled, "Understood." I joked with my grandfather quite a bit. We traded jabs on a regular basis, but I never liked to see him disappointed, and that's how he looked right now. As usual, though, in a couple of minutes he was past it. He looked across at me as I sat at the other desk and thought about my day. My grandfather said, "What's wrong, Michael? I know that look." "Just general stress. Someone trying to kill you tends to do that." Seamus chuckled. "They tried to kill Alonzo, too. Unless I'm mistaken, he's tickled pink by it. Something about missing the action from his old life. That makes him insane. He may be insane, but he has re-energized the school and brought out a whole on-top population of students who never had an interest in sports before. And it's not just soccer. He understands basketball as well. I think his real genius is in motivation. I won't soon forget how he helped me when those men tried to shoot me the other day. I'm glad he's a good coach, but I'm even happier he was a tough cop." Seamus put down his coffee and straightened some papers on his desk. "What have you got planned for today?" "I'm going by to visit Juliana in Brooklyn at the TV show set." I saw him perk up immediately. "Let me come with you." He sounded like a kid pleading to go with his parents. I said, "I'm just going to say hello and then get back to work." "You won't deny an old man the chance to see his great-granddaughter, will you? I love to see what the set looks like." "Give me a break. Old man, that's laughable. You get around the city better than I do." Then Seamus said the one thing that always got him his way. "Please." I let out a heavy sigh and said, "Okay, but dress in civilian clothes. We don't want to freak out the movie types. Or maybe they'll think you're an extra from another set who wandered over. Either way, don't wear the collar." He sprang from his seat and called out, "Come on, Alonzo! Michael is taking us to Brooklyn!" I mumbled, "What the hell? The more the merrier." Chapter 79. Alex Martinez was in a good mood. She could see the light at the end of the tunnel on this job, which seemed to go on and on. All she wanted to do was go home to her ranch and her daughters and live her life. She'd already turned down a job offer she'd gotten earlier in the morning. A Swiss banking cartel needed her to clean up a mess in Marseille, France. They had a bank president who had showered his family with gifts paid for through embezzlement. News of the scandal would cripple the stock price, but a fatal hit-and-run would solve everything. She politely turned the job down. Then they offered her even more money. She turned it down again, and they said what everyone says. "It's an easy job. You could phone it in." Alex said, "If it's that easy, why don't you handle it yourself?" She felt invigorated when she hung up the phone. Now she was walking onto the set of Century's End. Dressed in a very sharp skirt with a very conservative blouse, she walked through the hallway with purpose and drive. Not one person questioned her presence. Sitting at the far end of the set, in a director's chair, was the young woman she was looking for. She ran it through her head one more time to make sure she called her Jules, not Juliana. She wanted this to move quickly and smoothly. She just needed to lure the girl away from the set, then make contact with her father. Alex didn't like using a stunt like this. She was not much for traumatizing a young person not involved in any crime, but she had to make a choice. Bennett had proved to be resourceful and dangerous, and she wanted to get home. Immediately. The other issue was the girl herself. She'd be able to identify Alex if anyone could find a photo. Alex wasn't too worried about that. First, she had to get Bennett into the right position. Then she'd worry about witnesses. Juliana Bennett was having a serious conversation with an attractive young man. The name on the back of the chair was K. Jason. She had no idea who he was. She'd only done research about Juliana. Both young people looked up as she came to a stop in front of them. When she concentrated, Alex had almost no accent when she was speaking English. She looked directly at Juliana and said, "Hello, are you Jules Baez?" The girl hesitated, then said, Yes, I am. I'm Alice Marshall with the Suzanne Grossman Talent Management Company. Have you heard of us?" Juliana's face lit up as she said, "Of course I have. You guys are one of the biggest agencies on the East Coast." Alex didn't rush it. She felt a surge of confidence in her plan. She said, "If you have a few minutes, I'd love to talk about representing you." The girl smiled from ear to ear. "Yeah, I don't have a stage call until afternoon." "Great. Can I take you out to an early lunch somewhere close by?" "Absolutely." She was standing gathering her purse. As Alex started to turn, the young man who was sitting next to Juliana said, "I'm K. Jason. Would you like to talk to me too?" Alex could recognize the smugness on this young man's face. She couldn't resist saying, "No, thank you." She was rewarded with a snicker by Juliana. Everything was going as planned.